From the depths of the ancient desert, a nation of unimaginable strength rose. With power, they thought they were untouchable. But arrogance became their greatest weakness. Allah sent them a warner, a prophet who stood alone against giants. They mocked him, they rejected him, and they challenged Allah himself. Then the sky turned black, and the wind began to scream. Not a single giant remained. This is not legend. The nation of Ad. In a land swallowed by time, beneath deserts that stretch farther than the eye can see, there once lived a nation so powerful, so colossal, that even the ruins of their existence were whispered about with trembling awe. Their bodies were enormous, their strength unmatched, their pride towering higher than the pillars they carved into the earth. And yet, despite their might, their story ends not with victory, but with a warning carved by the hand of Allah himself. Before we go deeper into this forgotten chapter of human history, tell me from which country you are watching this, and if you truly love Islam and its stories that strengthen the heart, then join this journey and stay with us. Long before the rise of empires and kingdoms known today, long before the pharaohs etched their names into stone, there existed a mighty tribe called Ad. They lived in a region known as Al-Ahqaf, a vast expanse of dunes in the southern Arabian Peninsula, a land shaped by winds that whispered of secrets buried beneath ages. Ad was not an ordinary people. They were giants among mankind, blessed with physical forms far beyond what people today can imagine. Many scholars of tafsir mention that their bodies were tall, broad, and immensely strong, their lifespans long enough to cultivate a society so advanced and formidable that no tribe around them dared to challenge their authority. They built structures supported by towering pillars, monuments that reached toward the sky as if they were conquering even the heavens. Allah refers to them as Ad-Iram, possessors of lofty pillars, a civilization gifted with prosperity beyond measure. Their lands were fertile, their valleys green, their flocks abundant. They mastered architecture, agriculture, trade, and warfare. But with every gift came a test, and Ad failed theirs with devastating arrogance. Instead of gratitude to their Creator, they worshipped idols carved by their own hands. They gave their statues names, decorated them, and believed these lifeless stones controlled rain, provision, and destiny. Their immense strength made them believe they were invincible. They would boast that no force on earth or in the sky could overpower them. They walked with the pride of men who thought they could never fall. Among these giants, Allah raised a man whose courage outshone their physical power, a man whose heart remained firm even when surrounded by a nation overflowing with pride. His name was Hud, a prophet chosen from among their own people. He grew up knowing their customs, their strengths, their ways, their arrogance. He was respected for his honesty, his reliability, and his noble character long before prophethood came to him. But the moment he stood before them with the message of Allah, everything changed. Hud reminded them that their power did not come from the idols they carved, nor from their own strength, but from the Lord who created them. He called them to worship Allah alone, to abandon false gods, to abandon pride, and to remember that all strength belongs only to the one who gives and takes. Yet a nation that believed in its own invincibility could not accept such a call. They mocked him openly, calling him foolish, accusing him of being bewitched, and demanding to know why they should follow a man who seemed weaker than them. Their chiefs and elites laughed at him in their gatherings, whispering insults and spreading lies to turn people away from him. But Hud was not shaken by their scorn. He stood tall in the face of giants, reminding them again and again that he was a trustworthy messenger, that he sought no reward from them, and that he wished only for their salvation. Even when their threats grew sharper, even when their mockery became harsher, his heart remained anchored in the truth Allah had given him. He warned them of what happened to nations before them, nations that were destroyed for walking the same path of arrogance. He asked them to reflect on their blessings, on their strength, on the lands they cultivated, and to recognize that none of it existed except by the permission of Allah. But Ad had grown so blind with pride that even clear signs could not penetrate their hearts. They questioned how a single man could be right, while a whole nation stood against him. They questioned how anything could harm them when they themselves felt stronger than the very mountains they lived near. Their pride was like a wall, thick and unbreakable, and they hid behind it as Hud tried to guide them with gentleness, patience, and unwavering faith. And although they mocked him and accused him, Hud remained steadfast, knowing that truth does not become false just because the majority rejects it. Hud continued to call his people with patience that could only come from a heart strengthened by Allah, and his words echoed through the gatherings of Ad like a steady wind attempting to soften a mountain of pride. He warned them with sincerity, reminding them not of distant nations they had never heard of, but of their own reality, of the truth in front of their eyes, of the blessings they were drowning in without gratitude. He told them that their strength was not proof of divine favor, and their size was not a shield against the decree of Allah. He reminded them that blessings can become punishments when arrogance takes over a heart, and that a nation that forgets its creator stands on the edge of a cliff, even when it appears invincible. Yet the people mocked and dismissed him. They laughed among themselves, saying that his warnings were nothing more than empty threats, that their idols would protect them, and that their sheer power would crush any calamity that might come their way. They could not see that the ground beneath them was already trembling with the consequences of their disbelief. Hud continued to speak, trying to awaken their hearts, but their chiefs, men of influence, wealth, and towering bodies, told their people to ignore him. They spread lies, claiming that Hud was only causing trouble. They accused him of wanting status, authority, and control, even though he repeatedly reminded them that he sought nothing from them, not wealth, not power, not praise. He only wanted them to be guided. But arrogance is like a disease that blinds its host to even the brightest truth, and Ad refused to listen, pushing away every reminder, every sign, and every call to humility. Their hearts became as hard as the pillars they carved, and their pride grew taller than their enormous bodies. And so the warnings from Allah began. The first sign came quietly, without thunder or destruction, without a single stone falling from the sky. It began with the most essential mercy that all humans depend on: rain. For the first time in many years, the skies above Ad remained empty. Clouds passed without dropping a single drop of water. The soil that once flourished with green life began to crack. Animals that once grew fat on lush pastures now wandered restlessly, searching for water that no longer flowed. The people of Ad watched as their fertile valleys dried up, as their crops shriveled, as the life they took for granted slowly slipped out of their hands. This was not a normal drought. This was a sign from Allah, a direct warning that something was deeply wrong. Hud explained to them that Allah was withholding rain because of their arrogance, their worship of idols, and their rejection of the truth. He pleaded with them to turn back, to seek forgiveness, to humble themselves before Allah, so that the sky might open once again with mercy instead of punishment. But even in their desperation, Ad refused to accept the truth. Instead of turning to Allah, They clung tighter to their idols, gathering around them, decorating them, begging them for rain. They stood before statues that could not hear or speak, calling them by names they themselves invented, believing that these powerless creations would save them. They said, "Hud has brought us nothing but bad luck. Before him, our lands were prosperous. He is the cause of our misfortune." Their mockery grew even stronger, their tone sharper, even as the sun above them burned hotter each day. The drought was a message from Allah, but they chose to interpret it as a reason to hate his messenger. Such is the nature of a heart blinded by pride. As the days passed and the drought deepened, even the strongest men among Ad began to feel weakness in their bones. Their mighty bodies, once sources of pride, could not withstand the heat and hunger. Their children cried for water, their animals collapsed in the fields, and the people who once declared themselves unbeatable started to fear the possibility of death. Yet their fear did not lead them back to Allah. Instead, they told Hud, "Bring us the punishment you threaten us with, if you are truly telling the truth." They demanded destruction as if they were daring Allah to act. They believed they were too powerful to be harmed, too mighty to be punished. They could not comprehend that their strength was nothing compared to the decree of the one who created them. The drought grew worse. The ground, once full of life, now resembled a vast graveyard of cracks and dust. People who once stood tall with pride now walked with weary steps, some leaning on their carved pillars for support. And then, one day, the skies shifted. A cloud appeared on the horizon, dark and heavy, moving across the desert with a presence that felt almost supernatural. The people of Ad rejoiced at the sight, their faces lit with relief and excitement. They shouted to one another that the gods had finally answered them, that rain was coming at last, that their suffering was over. They ran toward the approaching shadow with hope that erased all fear, believing that mercy had returned. But Hud stood still, his face filled not with hope but with sorrow, because Allah had revealed to him the truth behind that cloud. It was not rain. It was not mercy. It was the punishment they had demanded. Allah said, "Rather, it is what you sought to hasten, a wind carrying painful punishment." What approached them was not relief, but the beginning of a storm, unlike anything the world had ever seen. The wind that gathered inside that cloud carried the power to tear mountains apart. It was the answer to their arrogance, the response to generations of disbelief, the final chapter for a nation that mistook strength for immortality. Their celebration turned quickly into confusion as the cloud moved closer and its roar became louder, like a beast awakening from centuries of slumber. The air grew colder, then hotter, then strangely still. The ground beneath them vibrated as if the earth itself feared what was coming. Hud called out once more for them to return to Allah, to seek forgiveness even now, but the people of Ad were blinded by ignorance and refused even at the edge of destruction. And the wind was preparing to descend upon them, carrying with it the decree of the Almighty. The people of Ad stood beneath the darkening sky with hearts that fluttered between hope and triumph, convinced that the enormous cloud rolling toward them was a gift of rain sent to rescue them from months of suffering. Their voices rose in celebration as they pointed toward the horizon, calling their families, their children, and their elders to witness the cloud that stretched across the desert like a towering mountain of shadow. They said to one another that their idols had finally answered, that their prayers had been heard, and that relief was on its way. They believed this moment marked the end of their drought, the return of their prosperity, and the proof that the words of Hud were nothing but empty threats. But Hud watched them with a sorrowful stillness, for Allah had shown him clearly what they could not see, and the truth weighed upon him heavier than any burden. That cloud was not a bringer of life. It was a punishment destined to fall upon a nation that had exhausted every last chance Allah had given them. As the cloud approached, it grew darker and larger, swallowing the sunlight and cooling the air with an unnatural chill. The people gathered outside their homes, lifting their hands in joy, laughing, crying, hugging, believing their suffering was finally over. They could not imagine that within that darkness was a force more devastating than anything they had ever known. Hud raised his voice one last time, urging them to see the truth, telling them that this was the punishment they had challenged Allah to bring, the very destruction they mockingly demanded. He warned them that the wind inside that cloud would not bring rain, but pain. It would not give life, but snatch it away with a power no giant body could withstand. But the people of Ad had sealed their hearts long ago. They turned away from him, some laughing, some shaking their heads, some shouting insults, believing he was only trying to frighten them. The first breath of the wind touched the edges of their city like a whisper, cold and sharp. A few of the people paused, confused, because no wind had blown for months, and this wind felt nothing like the cool, refreshing breeze of rainstorms they remembered. It carried a strange weight, as if it was alive, as if it was watching them. Then the whisper became a growl. The cloud overhead churned violently, the winds inside spinning like an unseen beast, awakening from an ancient cage. People looked around, suddenly uneasy, but still hopeful, still unable to understand the danger towering above them. The growl deepened into a roar that shook the air, and the wind surged forward with a sudden burst that sent dust spiraling into the sky. Children screamed. Animals panicked. The strongest men shielded their eyes as sand whipped across the ground. The celebration died. Fear replaced joy. Yet this was only the beginning. What came next was a storm described in the Quran as a furious, screaming wind unleashed upon a nation that had challenged its Lord. It descended on Ad with a force that tore through their lands like a blade of divine judgment. The wind roared with such violence that even mountains seemed to tremble. It ripped through their homes, uprooted their pillars, shattered their monuments, and hurled debris across the desert with terrifying speed. Ad, whose strength had once intimidated all around them, now found themselves powerless against a force that was invisible, unstoppable, and sent by the Creator they had denied. The wind lifted men as if they were weightless feathers, throwing them across the land with a cruelty no human had ever witnessed. Their giant bodies, which once stood as symbols of pride, now spun helplessly in the air, tossed like leaves in a storm. Their cries echoed through the desert as the storm tore through them, without mercy. It lasted 7 nights and 8 days, each moment more destructive than the last. The storm did not weaken. It did not calm. It intensified relentlessly, battering every inch of their land, crushing everything they had built. The Quran describes them as lying across the earth like uprooted palm trunks, their tall bodies broken, their limbs shattered, their pride crushed. The same people who once boasted, "Who is stronger than us?" were now scattered across the desert like straw. Their idols lay shattered, their temples collapsed, their pillars snapped in half, their entire civilization erased as if it had never existed. The mighty Ad, the nation of giants, became a lesson for all of humanity, preserved in the words of Allah but wiped from the face of the earth. The storm's fury echoed across the dunes until nothing remained except silence. When the final dawn broke after 8 days, the winds withdrew suddenly, leaving behind a landscape that no longer resembled anything Ad had known. Their once fertile valleys were buried under layers of sand. Their massive construction, once admired for its grandeur, lay pulverized beneath the weight of Allah's decree. There was no trace of life, no movement, no sound. All that remained was the memory of their arrogance and the severity of their downfall. Hud and the believers who followed him stood far away, protected by Allah, witnessing the aftermath with hearts filled with awe and fear of their Lord's power. They had been saved because they believed, because they listened, because they submitted wholeheartedly to Allah even when surrounded by a nation that ridiculed them. Hud saw the land where he had grown up, now lying destroyed before him, a reminder that no nation, no matter how strong, can overpower the decree of Allah. Every lesson he had tried to teach his people was now carved visibly into the sand. Strength without faith is nothing. Pride without gratitude leads only to ruin. And disbelief, no matter how confident it seems, collapses the moment Allah's command arrives. This storm, this punishment, this collapse of an entire civilization became a sign for all people who would come after, a story recited in the Quran not merely to inform but to warn, to awaken hearts, to remind every generation that arrogance leads only to destruction. Ad once walked the earth as if they owned it. Allah showed them how quickly that sense of ownership can turn into dust. The same wind they dismissed became the wind that erased them. And the same warnings they mocked became the very truth that sealed their fate. When the storm finally died and the last echoes of its rage faded into the empty desert, the world of Ad was gone forever, buried beneath endless waves of sand that swallowed their pride, their structures, and their memories. The land that once held the voices of giants was now a silent graveyard, a haunting reminder of a nation that believed nothing could overpower them. And in that silence, Hud stood with the small group of believers who had followed him, their hearts trembling as they looked upon the remains of a civilization that once seemed unshakable. They watched the wind settle over the ruins, carrying away dust and fragments of shattered pillars, and they understood that they were witnessing not just the end of a people, but the unfolding of a divine promise. Allah saves whom He wills, and destroys whom He wills, and every command He gives is carried out with absolute justice. Hud felt the weight of the moment, knowing that this destruction was not merely a punishment, but a message for every soul that would hear this story until the end of time. He remembered the endless hours he spent, calling his people with kindness and patience, warning them with a heart full of mercy, pleading with them not to walk the path of arrogance that doomed nations before them. He remembered their laughter, their mockery, their insults, their disbelief, the way they stood tall with chests full of pride, claiming they were the strongest creation on earth. And now, all that pride lay scattered beneath the hot desert sun. Their voices were silenced, their strength shattered, their glory erased. Only the truth remained, rising from the ruins like a whisper of warning to all who would come after. Hud and the believers moved slowly across the edge of the devastation, careful not to step into the places where bodies once lay lifeless like palm trunks ripped from the earth. The believers were shaken, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Allah's power and the fragility of human arrogance. Every grain of sand seemed to carry a reminder that nothing in this world stands forever except the command of Allah. They reflected on how quickly strength can disappear, how swiftly wealth can vanish, how easily a civilization can fall when it turns away from its creator. These were people who once built towering structures, who once walked the earth with confidence, believing no force could overcome them. Now they were gone, and only a prophet and a small band of faithful followers remained. Hud thanked Allah for His protection, for His mercy, for saving them from a fate they did not have the strength to escape alone. He understood that those who submit to Allah may face hardship, ridicule, and resistance, but in the end, they are the ones who find safety, while those who reject the truth are left to face the consequences of their own actions. He reminded his people that faith is not measured by numbers, nor by power, nor by physical strength, but by the sincerity of the faith, heart, and the willingness to obey Allah, even when the world stands against you. Their survival was not an accident, not coincidence, not luck. It was a deliberate mercy from Allah, given only to those who trust Him fully. With the ruins of Ad behind them, Hud guided his people away from the cursed land, leading them to a new region where they could rebuild their lives upon the foundation of faith and gratitude. They carried with them the lessons carved into their memories, lessons they passed to their children and grandchildren, ensuring the story of Ad would never be forgotten. Generations later, tribes and travelers would pass by the vast desert where Ad once lived and hear the warnings of Hud, repeated by those who survived. They would hear how a mighty people fell, how giants crumbled, how a powerful civilization vanished because they chose pride over submission. And these lessons spread far beyond that region, becoming a part of the divine revelation itself. The Quran preserved the story of Ad so that hearts would not grow blind, so that people would not repeat the same mistakes, so that nations would remember the danger of arrogance. Allah told us about Ad not as a tale of ancient history, but as a living reminder that applies to every generation, every society, every human who begins to believe that strength and success come from themselves alone. In their rise, we see the seduction of power. In their arrogance, we see the deception of pride. In their destruction, we see the consequences of ignoring the truth. And in the survival of Hud and his followers, we see the reward of patience, faith, and obedience. Hud spent the remainder of his life teaching, guiding, and reminding his people of the signs they had witnessed. He told them that Allah is not unjust, that He does not destroy anyone without warning, without mercy, without endless chances to return. Ad was destroyed not because they were strong, but because they refused to bow before the one who created their strength. They were buried not because they were giants, but because they allowed their size to blind them to the reality of their dependence on Allah. And Hud ensured that no one who heard his story would ever forget this truth. Arrogance is the root of downfall, and humility is the path to salvation. As Hud grew older, he looked upon his people with a heart full of gratitude, knowing that Allah had saved them from a fate they could never have escaped on their own. He saw children growing up with faith as their foundation, families worshipping Allah together, people living with gratitude instead of pride. And he knew that this was the true victory, not the survival of a body, not the strength of a civilization, but the strengthening of hearts that recognize the greatness of Allah. The story of Ad became one of the greatest warnings in human history, a story recited by prophets, remembered by scholars, and written in the eternal words of the Quran. Today, when we read their story, we are not reading about strangers. We are reading about ourselves, about our societies, our tendencies, our weaknesses, and our dangers. Every generation that grows arrogant is reflected in Ad. Every heart that becomes blind to gratitude is reflected in Ad. Every nation that believes it cannot fall is reflected in Ad. And every believer who remains patient and faithful in the face of mockery is reflected in Hud. Their story is eternal because the lessons inside it are eternal. The ruins are gone, buried under countless layers of sand, but the warning remains alive in the words of Allah. Ad is gone, but their arrogance survives in anyone who rejects humility. And the mercy shown to Hud survives in every believer who trusts in Allah no matter how overwhelming the world around them seems.